Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the sixth and final session of EDL 700, Creating Professional Learning Communities. And the last time that you'll have to look at my ugly mug this term. A reminder to you that we won't have a Zoom session next week, but you will have a final exam, but you've already got that in your hands. It'll come at you, the final exam will come at you in the form of a Google form, like your other assignments have. And a reminder also that March the 9th is the due date on the week 7 assignments, and that's a Saturday instead of a Sunday. I will, several of you have pinged me and asked if I would be opening Module 7 early, and yes, in fact, if things go according to plan, I'll open that thing up for you tomorrow. I was actually in Shreveport the last 3 days, and so it kind of interrupted my weekly workflow. But I should have that Module 7 posted for you on tomorrow at some time. As we're thinking about moving toward the end here of the term, one of the things about those of us that are in leadership positions or presumed to occupy those lofty places, you're going to find more and more as you think more like a leader, and those of you that are already in that role are probably already there. You're always on the lookout for talent, people that you think you would like to work with or for. And so as you're thinking about that and you see the work, that's one of the reasons that I like to turn your work back to you. And obviously it's a reason I like to use the discussion forums, but the opportunity for you to network with really talented other people all over this country and all over this planet provides you an opportunity that a traditional face-to-face classroom really does not offer. And so if you've got folks in the class that you seem to really connect with, or you really like the way they think, I advise you not to lose that connection with them even as the term ends, even if you have to try to get their personal email address on the side somehow, or cell phone numbers anymore. Both my daughters they spend a fair amount of their time doing online teaching, and they're excellent, as they call it, creepers. They can find almost anybody on the planet and tell you quite a lot about those people, and they don't even have Google Analytics in the process. Another thing too, one of the reasons that I turn your work back, the collective work back to all of you week by week, is there's a lot. Not only is there a lot of intelligent submission there, there are a lot of resources that come up in those conversations, books that people have read, softwares that they are using, strategies that they use, those kinds of things. So I advise you to somehow, some way save those collective intelligence repositories. In one class I call it the Collective Intelligence Treasure Chest, and the other class I call it the Brain Trust. I forgot what I called it last term. But you get the idea. Save that stuff if you think, and particularly those of you that may be interested in pursuing a doctorate later on down the way. There's a pretty rich treasure trove of resources and that you can call upon in later work. Even those that don't pursue a doctorate, presumably you may be, most all of you will be involved in developing or crafting professional development activities for faculties, either at the campus or district level, and maybe even writing articles along the way as well. PLCs, I've said it before, let me say it again, just so you can't escape this class without at least being touched by the possibility. Professional learning communities are something that we are, that's not something that we do. And just like any other community that you're involved in, the question is not whether you are a Texan, or you are a Baptist, or you are a member of the HOA where your home is. The question is the quality of that community, and the culture of that community determines the quality and the value that you take out of it. So as you and I think about our leadership role in those PLCs, we become more and more responsible for trying to ensure the health and well-being of those things. Culture has been the topic last week, and it's one that, in fact, I think I've got a couple ideas for my next book. I really think maybe I need to write one on culture shaping, but culture is very much like gravity. It's a constant force that pulls on us steadily. Unlike gravity, we have the ability to influence that pull. Actually, from any position within the organization, we influence that pull, but those of us that have leadership roles are in uniquely opportunistic positions to have some influence on the culture. I was having a conversation with Tracy Johnson and Dr. Perry last week about that very thing. And I think I may have mentioned this to you all before, but assistant principals come and go, superintendents come and go. Our impact, the impact that you and I have on that school, that camp, either the campus or the district as a whole, it is directly proportional to the impact that we have on the shaping of the culture and when we're part of that organization. And actually, I'll go ahead and add this one more thing too. We can have influence on the culture of that organization long after we're gone through the mentees that we leave behind whenever you and I move on from that organization to another one, or like myself, into the happy land of retirement and chasing cows around the countryside. The PLCs provide for us, and as we've talked about before, it's not just one PLC. You're a member of many PLCs at one time, and it's the same thing. An analogy would be, most of you are either a son or a daughter. You also are most of you are a sibling. Most of you are either a parent, perhaps. Most of you have membership in some sort of social groups. Most of you have membership in some sort of house of faith. And so you're members of all these different kinds of cultures and subcultures. And subculture was a topic that came up in one of our the content items that I shared with you. And I actually like to have a conversation that when I'm doing work in a professional development setting or a conference to talk about the way the subcultures influence each other, and also they overlap and intertwine. It's almost like, as an old math teacher, it's like a Venn diagram with intersecting sets. In our responses this week, I'll comment on some of the things I've seen and read that kind of tripped my trigger a little bit. Carolyn, Carolyn, I apologize if it's Caroline. I'm not sure. I haven't heard you pronounce it, so I'm not how you prefer that to be pronounced. But she mentioned that culture is a good way to retain teachers, and I connect this back to the comments that I made earlier about being on the constant lookout for talent. Absolutely. You and I have had the conversation, I think, that the difference in where your campus is and where you want it to be is directly proportional to the quality of the people that you have working in that school. And it's not that you just go out and get to buy or hire all the talent that you want. It's a combination of taking the ones that you have and raising their level, their capabilities, to build their capacity. But when you have the opportunity to hire, it being very purposeful and very deliberate in the processes that you use. But even trickier is that when you do manage to get your hooks into some talented people, you got to keep them. And what we now know from the research is that the quality of the work environment has everything to do with whether people will stay in that organization with you or not. So Carolyn nailed it. If you're thinking like a leader now and you're interested in a high-performing organization, you have to be thinking about the constant constantly on the lookout. You're in the recruiting mode all the time. And that means at the cafe, at the professional development conferences, at the district level meetings. I had a rather, I kind of liked the reputation, not all the other principals in the district, but when I worked in a couple of large districts as campus principal, every year we had the Teacher of the Year banquets, usually in April. And so at those banquets, there would be somewhere between 40 and 75 campuses honoring their Teachers of the Year. And there I was, an old high school principal. So my eye was particularly on those middle school and high school Teachers of the Year. So as soon as the banquet was over, I would beat it to the front of the room, and I would introduce myself personally to each one of those Teachers of the Years from the other campuses. And I would say something like, "Hi, I'm Nelson Coulter, principal over at ABC High School. We haven't met, but whenever you get ready to look for another job, think of us." And the other principals, actually, they got to where they would, start doing a basketball blocking move on me so I couldn't get to their teachers. But and some of them actually whined to the boss a little bit. And I can remember my boss kind of nipping at me one time on the phone about that. "Nelson, you got to quit trying to recruit from other campuses." And I said, "Dr. P, here's the deal. You hired me to make our high school the best school I could possibly make it. The way I do that is get the most talented people I can into that building. So if the other principals cannot create the conditions that will hold their employees, that's their problem and not mine." She didn't like that, but okay. She and I did not agree on several things. Although, I'll say this about that, because as you become campus principals, just like there's generally a sort of an assumed tension between teachers and the administrative level. It takes a lot of work for administrators to try to reduce those barriers, but there's that constant, basically, we call it, it's basically the management labor tension dynamic. It's always there. It never goes away. The same thing will occur when you become campus principals. You're going to feel that same sort of dynamic tension between yourself and central office a little bit, but most of the time, you will be in complete agreement about what needs to be done. Most of the time, the disagreements that you have are on the speed at which those things can happen. So you're going to get pissed at your bosses from time to time. Don't burn bridges. Figure out ways to work with them. And if you really end up getting a really toxic one, it's like we were talking about a week or two ago, I think, with Andy. Sometimes it's life's too short, and you have to decide if you really want to spend that much of your life laying awake at night looking at the ceiling, and worrying about things you can't change. Let's talk about hiring, because I really kind of got off into that, the recruitment piece, and then you got to figure out how to get the talent hired, and then you would try to retain it. And one of the most powerful ways to retain a talented team is to create a rich learning environment for all of you to work in. Those of you that are in the data class right now, we're having some really nice conversations over there about the teamwork. And this, of course, this week, the metaphor I chose for you all is PLC leader as coach, and I did that very purposefully. Our job, as I've mentioned to you before, is continually you're going to be shifting from a teacher of children to a teacher of adults. And the basic fundamentals are the same, although all of the, obviously the intellectual capability and the psychological prowess of those people are somewhat different. Third graders and 50-year-olds think a little bit differently for the most part. Most of them are very egocentric. All of us are, and we can't forget that. On the topic of culture shaping, Dr. Schlechte, and I've referenced him quite a lot over the years, over the classes, but he says that the most important task of teachers is to design engaging learning tasks. And I would extend his thinking to those of us in the leadership role. Perhaps our most important task is to design the learning task for the learning team, and that's all about culture shaping. I believe that is the most important work that you and I are engaged in, is impacting the culture. And on that topic, one of my favorite researchers, and actually he's not an educator, is Dr. Rupert Sheldrake out of the United Kingdom. One of the most interesting books I've ever read is one of his called Science Set Free. He's a scientist and a researcher, but he challenges 10 dogmas of science in that book, and you can look up a TED Talk of his that's titled the same way. I think, well, I say that, I'm not sure what the title is. It has to do with, it's either Science Set Free or something about the 10 dogmas. But he makes a very compelling case that we have to be curious to our very core and willing to challenge our own assumptions and rethink what we believe and why we believe it. But one of the most interesting theories that Sheldrake puts forth is what he calls morphogenic fields. And it really has everything to do with culture for you and me as we think about being culture shapers. And his Sheldrake's assertion is that culture is not something that you put in a book and you pass it from generation to generation or from building to building. And it's not something that you inject people with, with a syringe. And it's not something that you can force onto people. Although some organizations, the larger they get, they try to rely on bureaucratic structures to force some of that stuff, but it doesn't work. But Sheldrake argues that culture is, and here's a word you've heard me use so many times, and as long as you know me, you'll keep hearing me use it. But he talks about culture being basically the fluid transmission of collective habits. From one generation in an organization to the next, from one division in an organization to accompanying divisions, and even if you think about the subcultures in the organization as being either nested or overlapping, he says those habits of the organization, that culture, the commonly accepted and believed in norms, beliefs, rituals, stories, heroes, all that stuff gets transmitted in some way that goes beyond writing, that goes beyond videos, that goes beyond conversations, that it's sort of, he calls it fields. It's like a gravitational field that moves from one to the other. Very interesting kinds of stuff, and really woo-woo sounding, and those, you all probably figured out by now that I am not ready to dismiss the woo-woo. Dr. Muhammad seemed to resonate with quite a number of you. And one of the things that he mentioned in that video of his was that neither the Bush nor the Obama administration were successful at school reform, even though both tried. And I have witnessed that as an old guy, and having worked at the university level, I've been fortunate to be able to get a nice front row seat and to a lot of districts and campuses, particularly some that are struggling. And what I have seen again and again and again is efforts from the state or the federal level to impose interventions on a campus or a school district fail. But when I have seen schools transformed, it's always with a very thoughtful and deliberate and effective leader at the helm, working with a team of people that believe in that vision. And so bottom line is school transformation, in my view, always happens in the organic way, and it cannot be superimposed on a campus. Lord, I can talk to you about campuses, particularly some urban campuses I'm aware of, that have been years on years on years in that status, however that particular state grades them. but constantly on the edge of disaster, constantly. And they cannot seem to come out of that tailspin. PLCs cannot effectively operate by a script. Several of you have made comments over the weeks and even in previous terms about your objection to the idea of what we call teacher-proof curriculum or scripted curricula. And I'm with you on that. I absolutely agree with you. But PLCs cannot be scripted either. Those have to be led in a very organic way by very thoughtful people that know what the heck they're doing. And that's why you are in this class, and that's why I'm doing my dead level best to bump your thinking in ways to help you think about how you might effectively lead those things. As you assume more and more leadership roles, you're going to find, well, let me put it this way. Those cultures can be toxic. Cultures can be very healthy. As you think about the leaders of the school or the school districts, when you assume those leadership roles, then all of a sudden you become the primary person responsible for the health and the well-being of that organization. It's not like you own it by yourself, but you become the person that has the primary responsibility for the caretaking of the health and the well-being of that organization. Now, I'm not going to lead you down that path, but one of the thought exercises I like to do with folks, especially if I had you in a face-to-face environment where we could interact a little more authentically, we would spend some time with you thinking about how the school is like the human body, and but like your human body, and what makes it healthy, what makes it not healthy, the habits that you have that contribute to that health, and the habits that you have that might not be so helpful to your health. And we translate that conversation into the organizational environment. It's a pretty nice conversation to have. It's actually a very nice conversation to have with a faculty and during professional development time. On that topic, by the way, the healthiest communities we know of on this planet, they're little pockets of communities all over this globe. They call them blue zones, and you can do a Google search for blue zones. It happens to be communities and pockets of people that have a particularly high number of folks that live into their 90s and 100s. And those are called blue zones, but it's very interesting to take a look at some of the common denominators and lifestyles of those peoples in those blue zone communities, and then think about it from an organizational level. You know, how could I turn my school into a blue zone? Interestingly enough, there's quite a bit of movement in that. Some schools are taking on and some communities, actually, some cities are taking on the effort to become like a blue zone, which it means fundamentally making decisions in the interest of your health and well-being, very purposeful and changing of habits in that process. Dana and Amy both discussed the need for teachers to become masters of the concept of emotional intelligence as they manage their classrooms. Yeah, I agree with that, but I want to extend it to you, to invite you to think about it in terms of now you becoming a teacher of adults. First, let me make this point. Emotional intelligence, and that's Daniel Goleman stuff, remember, that's self-awareness, self-regulation, others' awareness, and relationship management. Those are powerful tools to teach a second grader. Those are powerful tools to teach a seventh grader. Those are powerful tools to teach a first-year teacher. Those are powerful tools to teach an assistant superintendent. So you never really get too old to develop your emotional intelligence. But if you think about it, if you were to tackle it as a whole school concept, just think about the possibilities there. That if you had a whole building full of children and adults that were operating at a very high level of emotional intelligence, that might be fun. That might really be a lot of fun. Goleman's framework is one that obviously I have internalized over the years, and I think it's a great model for you and I from a leadership perspective to think about. It's one, if for no other reason, you as a leader leading a leadership team. I can promise you. In fact, I watched a high-level executive at LSU Shreveport this last week in a team meeting. Have to exercise every one of her components of emotional intelligence in order to navigate the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, to quote Shakespeare, that she was getting pounded with. But and she's got high levels of emotional intelligence, I can assure you that. Katie commented on Peterson and Deal's article on the culture shaping. Peterson and Deal, I just love them. I think I recommended their book to you last week, but on the topic of climate and culture, and we talked about that a little bit last week, but I'll share with you one of the things that I have done over the years. Actually, Joanne, the secretary that worked with me, or as she says, executive administrative associate, she encouraged me at one point to begin having book studies with the clerical support team on the campus. And I said, okay. Hell, I'll have a book study with anybody. And so I began meeting once a month with the clerical staff. We would have lunch, we'd bring in sub sandwiches of some kind or something like that. And we would sit down and have book studies, and almost always the books, I chose the first book, but then I let them pick subsequent books in those book studies. But it was always around the concept of how we, customer service and how we serve our students and their families better. Had some great conversations. It's cost me 1 hour a month, plus whatever time it cost me to read. Because at those conversations, it wasn't like I was teaching them lessons. It was we had all read chapter 13 of some book, and I would just start asking a few questions about what they took out of them, not dissimilar from the questions I ask you. And it really was some really nice, rich dialogue. But it really made our team much more cohesive and much more focused on what I thought was particularly important, is that we serve our students well, and we also, that which also meant that we were serving the parents and the community well. Likewise, DeMarcus mentioned he referenced in the to the Dr. Muhammad video, he quoted, in fact, it said that it's a mix of anthropology, sociology, psychology, political history, and political science and history. Yeah, I agree. I have been telling my classes like you for the last 15 years. I believe those of us that presume to be campus leaders and district leaders have to be pseudo-psychologists, among all those, as well as sociologists and anthropologists and all that other stuff. Muhammad quoted Dr. Larry Lizette, and you might have missed that. Well, several of you listed this as your favorite quote out of that video, that culture eats structure for breakfast. Dr. Muhammad was actually quoting Dr. Larry Lizette, who did most of his research. He was a real thought leader in education in the 70s, particularly in the 70s and 80s. And he's a guy that came up with what is commonly known as effective schools correlates. Great stuff. But Muhammad then went into a discussion about the structural versus the behavioral aspects of our work, or the technical versus the cultural, if you will. And I agree with Dr. Muhammad. You and I, as leaders, we have to attend to the structural stuff. We got to make a master schedule. We got to make sure the floors are clean. We got to make sure the locks on the doors work, and we got to all that structural stuff. And you can make a few, especially when you move onto a campus. Generally, almost always, you can make a few structural changes and gain some short-term wins. If you just replace the broken windows in the building, people are going to think you could sell fried ice cream to Eskimos. But our real work on that cultural side, the real work is on the behavioral stuff that you and I are trying to impact, because that's the stuff that really deals with how the people in the building interact with each other, and they deal and interact with our customers, both the internal customers and the external customers. The topic of supervision, really, I don't cover it in my classes specifically, but Dr. Muhammad kind of touched on this. And if you read his book, which is an excellent book, he spends a fair amount of time on the topic of supervision. And if you're interested in another book on supervision, the works of Dr. Kim Marshall out of Massachusetts are just phenomenal stuff. I'm a real fan of his, but I'll just give you this quick little sermon on my theories of supervision. If you were a teacher working on my campus, I would be in your classroom all the time, in and out, in and out, in and out, in every classroom, everywhere in that building. And you would get, if I was in your classroom for a walkthrough or a formal observation, you would get feedback from me. And in most cases, that written feedback, at least early on, would be me catching you doing good stuff. I do not think there is much power at all for you to walk in classrooms and start giving people negative feedback right off the bat. They have to trust you first before they're willing to accept the negative feedback. But here are the two tripwires for me. If you're working with me, and it doesn't matter if you're a teacher or if you're on the support staff or if you're an assistant principal or if you're an assistant superintendent, my two tripwires is this. Is that person willing to get better? Because that's a requirement with me. We're going to be growing. Two, is that person able to get better at a pace that I'm willing to live with? And my lovely bride, Mo, by the way, I'm spending my anniversary with you all tonight. But don't worry about Mo. She assured me that she would just as soon have my money as my company after 42 years of holy matrimony. So she's happy for me to be with you tonight instead of her. And I think she's probably on Amazon shopping right now with the money I'm making. But is the employee willing to get better and able to get better at a pace I'm willing to live with? And those are the two tripwires with me. If the answer to either one of those is no, then the warm, fuzzy Nelson shifts leadership styles, and I become, I'm always going to be polite, courteous, and professional with everybody, but my focus, if I'm convinced you're not willing or you're not able to get better, then my focus shifts toward how can I help this person find another place to be as quickly as I can. And I always try to avoid the firing mode. When you'll learn this, some of you probably have already learned it, but whenever you go down the path of trying to fire somebody, it takes years off of your life, and it takes years off of the end of that other person's life. So it's just a real painful process. You'll have to do it from time to time. Looks like Dana may have already lived that experience at some point. Not fun. Both of you lay awake at night. You lose sleep. It causes heartburn. It disrupts your life, disrupts their life. And so anytime you can coach somebody out over firing them, it's a far better solution. Far better solution. Ty told a really cool shining star story in the Habitat prompt in our discussion forum. Reminded me of a campus I was a principal of, and I think I told you all I always supervised the special ed department. And on this particular campus, we had 64 adults working in the special ed department alone. It was a large group. And when I got there, they had adopted what they call the fish philosophy, which came out of the Pike's Place Fish Market in Seattle, Washington. Look it up on the Google. It's a really cool thing, but bottom line is that philosophy that they use at the Pike's Place Fish Market, and they call it the fish philosophy. They've made a cottage industry out of it, but they basically operate from a four-pronged way of doing business. One, play, have fun at work. Two, be there be present with the people that you're working with and the people you're serving. Three, choose your attitude. Always choose a positive attitude, no matter what the circumstances. And four, make their day. try to make sure that everybody that you encounter during that work process, in that work environment, has a positive experience from that interaction with you. For those of you that have gone to trouble to look at my own personal growth plan, you'll see evidence of some of that stuff on my own growth plan. Charles Duhigg wrote the book on the power of habit, and so I forced you to absorb some of his stuff. He mentioned in that content that habits are our brain's way of making sense of things, greasing the skid. I like to think of it as greasing the skids. What we now know from neuroscience is that the human mind really doesn't want to work any harder than it has to. So consequently, you don't have to think about how you brush your teeth or how you're going to shave or what you're going to put in your coffee in the morning. You do that your brain takes over and you begin doing some of that stuff routinely. And of course, obviously, your functions like breathing and scratching and those kinds of things are automatic responses too. But your brain, and this is an interesting point for you. I apologize if it's redundant. Our body weight, our brains weigh about 3 pounds, roughly. And so some of you, I think, are probably 3 bills plus. And then probably the smallest of you still weigh right in the vicinity of 100 pounds. So at the very most, your brain probably occupies 3% of your body weight. And for those of you that are large or pretty large folks, your brain may occupy 1% or even maybe perhaps less of that. But from an energy consumption perspective, our brains burn up 20% of the energy that our body is making. And our body is always in the business of making energy. So our brain, while they only occupy, let's call it just on average 2% of our body weight, it's burning up 20% of our energy. But the brain, interestingly, through evolution, has conditioned itself to not waste a lot of energy on unimportant stuff, like which side of the face you start to shave on. Once you start doing that a few times, and then this will help you remember. When most of you drive, I guess, vehicles. When you were first learning to drive and you were first learning to go in reverse, you remember how agonizing that was? You put it in reverse and you're trying to look over your shoulder and you got both feet on the brake and you can't see where you're going. Now, in the new vehicles, they got a camera for you. But and you just creep backwards a few inches and then look again. But over time, your brain has routinized all that stuff so that now most of you probably jump in your vehicle, throw it in reverse, start text messaging us, whoever you're working with that day, and go out back into traffic. And but it's because your brain has greased those skids. And that's the impact of habit. That is the impact of habit. And what Duhigg really reinforces with us is to think about what it is. Several of you resonated with the idea that almost half of what we do every day is purely out of habit. Yes, the same thing is true of your organization. The same thing is true of your organization. At least half of what goes on in your school every day is purely out of habit. So you and I can be very thoughtful in leading other people into those conversations about, are these habits helpful? Are they moving us toward our goals? Are they getting in the way of our goals? And if they're getting in the way of their goals, how do we change the cue so that we can change the habit so that we can change the reward? That's Duhigg speak. On the topic of habit and your and our responsibility for the health and the well-being of the organization that we serve. I'm going to relate it back to my personal health and a conversation I was having with my physician a few years ago. He's a young guy. He's about the age of some of you all now. I finally had to get rid of my old physician because I was afraid I was going to outlive him. And I got myself a young one. So I think Ben will live longer than I do, so he can take care of me even as I get up around 100 years old. But but I was having a conversation with my physician, Dr. Ben Edwards, and I had been for years, I had been taking some kind of over-the-counter pain reliever almost every day. I would either take Tylenol or Excedrin or an ibuprofen, whatever else, Motrin, Aleve, you name it, something every day, an aspirin. And one day I was talking to Ben about that, and he said, Nelson, at the risk of offending you, I want to say something to you. I said, okay, doc, let me have it. And he went, you do not have an ibuprofen deficiency in your body. And I thought, no, I don't. And he said, until you start thinking about what's causing your perceived need for the painkiller, until you start thinking backward and digging backward to what's causing the pain for you in the first place, it's never going to go away. All you're going to do is keep masking it. The same thing works for our organization. We do a lot of artificial contrivances and contortions in the interest of dealing with a symptom of a deeper problem. So those are the conversations that you can have about your habits. By the way, this is February, in the last 6 years and 2 months, I've had 6 aspirin total in 6 years and 2 months, after I went through the process that Ben was encouraging me to go through and think about what's causing the pain in the first place. Okay, books, and then I'll take your questions. Some books that came to my mind while I was reading your responses this week were The Ideal Team Player. In fact, I just finished that book by Patrick Lencioni, and How to Recognize and Cultivate the 3 Essential Virtues. Really a cool book, and Lencioni writes it first in the form of a story, like a novel. And then after he gets through with that short little novel or novelette, if you're novella, is that what English teachers call them, novellas, right? Anyway, at the end of it, then he launches into the academic conversation about how to identify ideal team players and to foster their talents. One of the books that had huge impact on by the way, Lencioni's book is a copyright 2016. One of the most influential books on my personal leadership thinking, it's got a little age on it, and Dr. Covey is now dead, but it was by Stephen Covey, and it was called Principle-Centered Leadership. And it's principle with a PLE, not a school principal. Great work, great influence on my thinking. And then a psychologist out of the University of Chicago in the late 90s wrote a very interesting book called Finding Flow. The Psychology of Engagement with Everyday Life. And if you're reading any kind of academic work, almost every book you read that's been copyrighted since 2000 on the topic of leadership or group dynamics or human performance is going to quote Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi out of the University of Chicago. That starts with his last name starts with a C-S-I-K. Csikszentmihalyi. Finding Flow. Great work. I'm going to shut up and let you ask me questions. We've got a few minutes. I can entertain some questions before I got to jump into that other class. So let me turn my notes off and let you fire questions at me. Dana also added to her previous comment, but then you have to relearn how to back up because you now have a camera to look at. Right. You know, even now, backing up, and I have the camera in a couple of my vehicles, it's hard for me to trust it. It's hard for me to trust it. Ask me questions if you got them. Brandy asked what other class this term, Brandy, I'm teaching EDL 707, which is using data for school improvement. And then obviously, as you know, I also am supervising the administrative interns some of you are in EDL 716, and some of you are in EDL 715. But and then I think next term I'm back on schedule to have the Intro to Graduate Research. Some of you have already gone through that mire with me. Thanks for your kind words, Amy. DeMarcus wanted to know if I could send a list. I can do you one better than that, DeMarcus. If you go to my website, nelsonwcoulter.com, one of my tabs along the top there are book recommendations, and I have them broken out under different topics. But one of the topics is leadership. But one of the topics is teaching and learning. So actually, there's quite a few books there on different topics. So you can, and I've got, and under each of those topics, I have them listed in alpha order. So go in there and take your pick. Other questions if you got them? Okay. I love being on your team. Thanks for hanging in there with me. You know how to get me if you need me. And it'll be a quick week and a half now. So hang in there. Be tough. Good night.